The educator Linda Darling Hammond wrote the following: "Many well-known adolescent difficulties are not intrinsic to the teenage years, but are related to the mismatch between adolescents' developmental needs and the kinds of experiences most junior high and high schools provide. When students need close affiliation, they experience large depersonalized schools. When they need to develop autonomy, they experience few opportunities for choice and punitive approaches to discipline. When they need expansive cognitive challenges and opportunities to demonstrate their competence, they experience work focused largely on the memorization of facts." She's right. I mean, what could be worse for kids who desperately need a feeling of connection than to plop them in a giant factory of a school where they feel invisible, anonymous, lost? What could be worse for kids who need a sense of control than to make them spend their days following other people's rules, telling them what to read, where to go, what to do? What could be worse for kids who need to make sense of themselves and the world than to treat them as passive receptacles into which information is poured? You know, it's as if high schools were deliberately designed to thwart teenagers, to give them the opposite of what they need. So I want to talk about what's wrong with high schools and how they can, and in some cases have been transformed. And I want to do that today. Fortunately, I can do that today with George Wood. George has been working for decades, not only to rethink the idea of high school at a national level, but to do something about it, to put those bold ideas into place, showing that it can be done, which he's done in a struggling rural community in the Midwest. George directed the Institute for Democracy and Education at Ohio University. He was later co-founder of the Forum for Education and Democracy. He was a key figure in a group called the Coalition of Essential Schools, which was the leading group working to transform high school education. He wrote books including Schools That Work and A Time to Learn, but most remarkably, he left academia to spend 28 years as a principal and later as a superintendent. He retired in 2021, but then, like a legendary spy or detective in a movie, he was called out of retirement for one last job. And he's back at it. He's back at work in that same little rural town. Today on Cone Zone, a guy who's helped to prove that public high schools truly can be progressive and democratic. I'm Alfie Cone. George Wood, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to talk with you about high schools. Later, your own and your interesting history. But to begin with, I was rereading not only some of your work, but other work about high school reform, including sort of the grandfather of high school critique, Ted Sizer's Horace's Compromise, and then Horace's School, and so on. Sizer, 40-some years ago, said traditional high schools that we've all come to accept are not in great shape, that students are rendered passive, anonymous. They're going through the motions of learning, and the teachers are often just going through the motions too. Do you agree with that? And if so, to what extent do you think it's still true in the 21st century?
Well, first, it's really good to be with you. Thanks for having me. Long time since we've last worked together. I think Ted was exactly right then, and that gave birth to the Coalition of Essential Schools and a number of other things. Is it different 40 years later, I think, is your big question. And I would say yes and no. Some things that Ted and the Coalition and others pushed real hard have become somewhat the norm. It's not unusual to find advisory programs in a high school. It's not unusual to find internship programs in high schools. It's not unusual to find block scheduling, right? Not doing 40-minute periods, but doing longer periods. But on the other hand, a lot of the structures have proved to be pretty doggone difficult to move. The notion that teachers teach a single subject, the notion that kids are punished by rewards, as someone I know once said, the notion that we can test and measure our way out of any problem. And in some ways, they're worse off. And that comes from the pressure from states and sometimes local school boards to limit what can be talked about and what can be discussed. So it's a mixed bag. And I have to tell you, I wonder why. Because things have changed so much, I think this is the moment they could be doing a lot of different things.
Why is this the moment?
Well, I don't know the whole country. Let me be clear. But I work in Ohio. When I started as a high school principal in 1992-93, we were saddled with batteries and batteries of tests that kids had to pass in order to graduate. First time it was the 9th grade proficiency test. Then they moved it to a 10th grade proficiency test. Then they had a 12th grade graduation test. Then in the early 2000s, 2010s, we saw end of course exams. And those things tended to ossify the high school. Every kid needed to take this sequence of courses because they had to pass tests. And the tests were predetermined, prescribed. That isn't the case in Ohio anymore. I was shocked. As you know, I've just come back to work. There are only 2 tests that high school kids have to take. One is English Language Arts 10th grade, right? The other is Algebra 1. They can take the test twice. Even if they fail at both times, then all they have to do is take a career technical education class and have a work experience, and they get credit for that test. So, in other words, there's no testing standard left for kids.
Well, to be clear, there are pervasive high-stakes tests in elementary and middle school. It's just that we're now down to about 8 or 9 states with high-stakes graduation tests in high school, right?
Right.
But you think that movement opens the door to other possible reforms that aren't related to high-stakes testing?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I've just come back and we're looking at our high school schedule, and one of the teachers mentioned, well, they've got to pass these tests. And I said, no, they don't. You do anything you want with the schedule. There's no requirement anymore. Here's the requirement. They pass an English class, they do, but there's no requirement.
So there's less constraint on teachers and principal with respect to a test-oriented curriculum in high school if there's no do-or-die graduation test, is your point. And then the question becomes, so now we have kind of a real-time, real-world study to see whether or to what extent it was those tests that were the limiting factor of really great teaching and organization of high schools.
Yes, and here's my very deep and deep concern, voiced many years ago by my dear friend and yours, Deborah Meyer. And it's a good teacher I know used to call it teachers' internalized sense of self-oppression. And they don't know what to do with the freedom because their entire career was in a very different system, one where they had to pass every test, and it's hard to get their eyes up as to what might be possible.
Or what could be and what's wrong with the status quo, even apart from testing, right? If you haven't experienced something else. So what are the goals we should have if we're starting out now to create a great high school? We're looking to promote what? Democracy, community, people being known to each other, meaningful thinking. What's on your list?
There's an Old Testament saying that goes, one of the prophets, I wish I knew which one and I could quote it to you today, but it was, where there is no vision, the people will perish. Mm-hmm. And I think you've touched on something that the starting point has to be, what's the vision? What do we believe young people ought to be like when we hand them that diploma and they walk across the stage at age 18? And let's start with the first thing. At that moment, they are fully enfranchised citizens of one of the most powerful democracies in the world.
Or one of the most powerful countries in the world, at least at this point.
Okay, got it. I'm with you on that. But let me say, my eternal hope, the reason I got into education was because it's this great experiment in democracy is, can you educate and prepare a citizenry to self-govern? Uh-huh. I mean, that's where I think you start with high school reform. What is it kids are going to be expected to do, young people, I should say, when they graduate? Mm-hmm. And it's not just vote. It's be engaged in the community. It's pay taxes. It's hold sustainable work. It's be neighborly. It's all that stuff. And I guarantee you they're not going to learn it by memorizing the Magna Carta. That might be a piece of what they use, but we need to start first with, what are the habits we want? I used to call them the habits of heart and mind that we want young people to leave the high school experience with. And by the way, it's not just the high school, it's the K-12 experience, but we're I used to call it democracy's finishing school. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we have to start.
So implicit in your notion that an informed, active citizenry is the beginning of the answer to the question, what are we looking for here, is, just to make this explicit, how they come out at the end is informing your notion of what should happen. I understand that, but I can imagine someone coming at the question differently and saying, here's what high school education should be for its own sake, and here's what we want to see kids doing in high school, irrespective of what they come out with. But you're starting from the end and working backward, right?
Yeah, that's my that's my approach.
Okay.
And I would say, Elfie, one of the things that gets in the way of this, that is a constraining factor that we've got to sort out, is a lot of folks have abandoned the democratic mission of public education and instead substituted a vocational mission. That is, school is just about kids getting a job. End of discussion. And life is so much more than that.
Right.
And there's no other place where we bring together our young to be prepared for that life. That's incredibly short-sighted.
Right. And every time every politician of either party and every corporate executive talks about schooling and education, it is exclusively in financial terms, and indeed about competitive terms, how our kids and companies can defeat their counterparts in other countries.
And that's not limited to party.
Right. Exactly.
You are right. I mean, we started hearing it, quite frankly, with Bill Clinton. And it's just carried from the president, just carried right on through.
And other Democratic governors back then, yeah. So to the extent participation in a democratic society, or turning a society into a democratic one, is paramount for you, What does that mean during high school? To what extent should the high school itself be democratic? And what does that mean to you?
So you raised the question perfectly because it operates at two levels. One is the knowledge and content, and one is the daily experience. It always seemed completely irrational to me that we believed we could put adolescents inside a building, never let them make a single decision except maybe what colors are at the prom. Give them hall passes so they can use the toilet. Totally control their lives, and then just send them out in the world and everything will be fine. Not the case. So it's the daily experience. Kids have to have control within reason, of course, of how they learn, what they learn, how they operate. They have to have real decision-making authority, monitored, of course, by wise adults. I mean, that's our job, is to point out that might be a mistake, might not be. Go ahead. And they also have to learn how to live conjointly. They can't be allowed to form cliques or live in small groups that don't associate with other groups of young people, right? I mean, those are some of the key elements of the social emotional life of democracy. Then there's the content side, which the first thing I think is so vital today is making sure in every class you're talking about how they get, sort, and evaluate information. They're overwhelmed with information. We all are. I have fallen prey to deep fakes generated by AI that show me things that I want to see, but they're not true.
Right.
So, so it's both how you think and how you see the other. And by the other, I mean other human beings, right? Those are the two fundamental things that school has to be thinking about all the time. Okay.
So part of it is structural, I guess, to try to create that kind of atmosphere. Let's go through it. School size, class size, number of kids per teacher. Let's talk about those three.
Let's start with school size. I'm a big proponent of small schools, but even some small schools act like big schools in drag, if you will. So you've got to use that smallness. For a big school, it means seeing what you can do to break it down. We're not going to close all these giant schools, and people do love a big gym and a big football field. And let's not forget those social pressures. We provide entertainment. We provide recreation. Class size, I think, I think it's more total load for a teacher during the day. Teachers have to have secondary teachers, and Ted was really clear about this back when he wrote Horace's Compromise.
80. That was his limit.
Pardon me?
80 was his suggested limit.
Yes.
No teacher,
absolutely.
High school teacher, should have more than 80 kids over the course of a day.
Right. Because you can't, Debbie Meyer once said, if we're going to help children use their minds well, we have to get to know their minds. Mm-hmm. We have to see them using their minds. If you're merely lecturing to a whole sequence of 7 classes and 150 kids, you got no idea how they're thinking. It's just not a thing. So I think it's overall load for a teacher during the day. It's creating opportunities for kids to have maximum freedom of thought and movement during the day. For example, we at one time here had a 1-hour lunch. And teachers would say, what are they going to do? And I said, nobody asks employees what they do with their 1-hour lunch. And I will tell you, they will do every bad thing they ever do. They will smoke in the bathroom. They might have sex in the ag shop. They might slip away. They're going to do everything you would expect adolescents to do, and that's why we're here.
You realize this episode is now going to be called Sex in the Ag Shop, right? So, but it's a mark of respect. You deserve not the Sex in the Ag Shop. It's a mark of respect to say you shouldn't be having a 12-minute lunch at 10:38, right?
God, yeah, no kidding. What happens is young people learn to manage their lives and their behavior when you give them the opportunities to do that. They won't learn it if they never experiment with it, right? And all we have to do as the adults in the room is make sure they don't do anything that will permanently damage them. They will make mistakes. They will do dumb things. They will fail a class. They'll, be sent to after-school detention because they did something wrong. That's going to happen. That's just a given.
Mm-hmm.
Let it happen so they learn.
Before we leave size, when you talk about school size and you talk about breaking it down, I mean, the major way to do that, structurally speaking, is what some schools, and we'll come to some examples later, have done, which is literally to create several autonomous high schools, or in other cases, middle schools, in the same building, sharing the same gym and cafeteria, but they're different schools. That requires some significant top-down structural organization. For districts that aren't ready or able to do that, to what extent can we get all the stuff we've already talked about and are about to talk about in a high school with 1,500, 2,500 kids?
It's tough, but there are ways within that to subdivide. The most powerful way I know of is through a really strong advisory system. We tend to think of teachers as only doing academic work with kids.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that isn't true, never has been true. So why not structure a way in which teachers work with a small group of young people over multiple years? And that's an advisory system, not the classic homeroom where you take roll, get the lunch count, and send them on.
Right.
But structured time in the school day. Every teacher has a group of children. You could have them for 2 years or 3 years or all 4, but you are their mentor, their home, if you will, in a school. I think that's a real powerful tool if you can make that move. The other move you can make in a large school that isn't ready to go to smaller schools is creating interdisciplinary teams that co-teach content to small groups of students.
Uh-huh.
So if you have, before I get there, the other structure is you have to limit the number of class periods. Kids cannot change classes every 3 minutes and have 8 classes and have any continuity or structure to their lives. And by the way, nobody else in the world does trumpet for 40 minutes, English for 40 minutes, PE for 40 minutes, then algebra for 40 minutes. Well, then we're going to do a dissection for 40 minutes, a small lunch, on and on, right? So
the alternative there, let's stick with that for just a moment, because that does challenge what most of us are used to. My kids had that system. I did. My father did. But if you have fewer moves, does that mean rejiggering the same number of classes so that each one lasts longer but meets on fewer days? Or does it mean that kids take fewer classes, period?
I've seen it done lots of ways.
Mm-hmm.
The way I'm most familiar with are extended blocks of time, and classes only last a semester. So, for example, 4 classes first semester, 4 classes a second. They still get 8 in the course of a year, but they don't get them all at the same time. I've also seen schools do A-B schedules with blocks of time.
Mm-hmm.
So they get 4 classes one day, 4 the next, 4 the next, 4, and then Friday's some combination of getting them all in. I have a preference for the former, but I know people who've done the latter and been very happy with it. So I think you have to create, remember, the only reason we have 40-minute classes was because the Carnegie Foundation in 1920 promised to fund university professors' pensions if high schools if they would only accept credit from high schools if kids sat in a seat for 120 hours in a class.
Yeah.
Well, back then there were only 120 days of school. Now there's 180 days of school. So you divide 120 by 180, you get 40 minutes. Boom, there's your class period.
The main reason
reality
for doing this reorganization, we were talking about making a big school feel small. Does that reform address that issue? Or is that
Yes.
does that address a different issue of like depth of intellectual inquiry or something?
It addresses both of them at the same time.
Uh-huh.
Right? If a young person only has 4 class periods, he's only got 4 adults to become familiar with, understand, and the adults have fewer kids to know. So it creates a smallness, but it also provides the opportunity to really dig into depth and content. And that's what we have to do. The old days of trying to cover everything are just over. There is so much information, you can't do it.
Right. Whether that's necessary to achieve the objectives, I think I certainly wouldn't dispute. But I think you would agree that it's not sufficient. I think of teachers, I've heard this more than once in the country, where block scheduling is proposed and the teacher's response is, well, how am I going to lecture for 2 hours?
Yep.
So let's talk about the pedagogy itself, the lecturing.
Sure.
You see that as problematic in its own right, no? As opposed to just something tied to other issues we've been addressing, such as too many kids to do a different kind of pedagogy with.
And let's go a little further.
Yep.
It's no longer just lecturing for an hour and a half. It's also do a web search for an hour and a half.
Uh-huh.
You know, I mean, you have to get beyond thinking that education is just a transmission of information. No, education is working with young people as they use their minds on an interesting problem. So teaching in long blocks is about problem setting and engaging in inquiry. And the old model of teacher is sage on the stage, or AI is sage on the stage, whatever, has to be dispelled with, because that's not how people learn to use their minds well. And that's our goal.
So we want them to use their minds well, to feel known and to know others. This requires less of the traditional focus on coverage, transmission of information. You want to see integration of disciplines. What about stuff like assessment, moving away from grades and tests? What about homework?
Well, as you and I both know, one of the great myths of American high school is that homework helps kids learn. No, homework helps kids learn how to do things wrong. Because they go home and their mom or dad, like me, when my kids came home with Algebra 2 problems, totally screwed it up. And their teacher had to reteach it the next day. So there's never been any research or evidence that establishes that homework helps kids learn. Some work outside of school, reading, reflecting, journaling, quiet work where kids aren't being asked to learn new things, is valuable and should be used. Kids have the time to do that, but they should never have to go home and try and relearn something or have to practice something maybe they haven't totally learned. I mean, that's just not a thing, right? It doesn't work. The other side you mentioned is assessment. Again, I am fascinated why we aren't driving a truck through the big open hole, which is universities. Let me tell you, universities still know the best indicator of kids' work in college are their high school grades. And if you make those grades or evaluations, let's say, dependent upon real work and real engagement, they're going to be really successful in college, but also in the world of work. And more importantly, in the world of citizenship. So it just seems to me this is a wonderful time. I know people are going to shrug and say, this can't be real. It is real. This is a moment when a lot of these things could change. But let me also say, I think a lot of people know we need that. They see our politics. They see our public life. It is mean. It is nasty. It is unpleasant. People are yelling at each other. They're not listening to each other. this is the moment when schools could be like the monasteries of the Middle Ages, where we preserve knowledge and wisdom and thoughtfulness and spread it out into the world. But that's my big dream. Sorry.
Okay. Well, monasteries of the Middle Ages, perhaps some disanalogies with what we're talking about, too. But
maybe not exactly right. Thank you.
So you're contrasting the actual work that kids are doing in learning versus standardized test scores. But I'm asking about the use of teacher-designed tests and the use of grades versus authentic forms of reporting their learning, and the extent to which you do or don't agree with me that those tests too and grades can undermine all of these other reforms if the point here is not to learn but to get an A and to do well on a quiz. Do you agree, or would you push back on that?
I would agree and push back simultaneously. Here's my agreement. Most assessments in schools measure the lowest form of intellectual activity. Memory, recitation.
Right.
We need to keep pushing, and you can do that if you have fewer kids and longer periods. We need to move to more measures of authentic assessment, where kids are really doing and using the tools that we've given them to show you that they know how to do things. Right. I will tell you, one of the best authentic assessments I ever saw was an end-of-term exam given by a physical education teacher who had been working with kids on body image and weight and things like that. And the assessment was they came to her desk, she had a big bowl of candy bars. They took a candy bar, and then she had them analyze what was in that candy bar and then design a workout that would burn all those calories. And I thought, perfect. Young people thinking about what they consume. And this is a PE class. Alfie, this is not science. This is phys ed, right? I mean, it was great.
Yeah, that's lovely.
But now on the grades is where I'll push back a little bit.
Okay.
And I think grades, I will agree with you in principle. The grades are not a good tool. Who knows what an A- versus a B+ is, or a C- versus a D. It's just kind of crazy. It's almost, for me, a bridge too far for many schools, that they still have to, parents still rely on it. Colleges still rely on it. Employers look at grade point. It's just, to me, the first step is like what we did here was we still gave grades, but every kid also had to present a real portfolio of their work for graduation. They couldn't graduate on grades alone. They had to provide a portfolio that demonstrated all their skills. I will tell you, parents always showed up for portfolio presentations. They never came to make sure they had the grade card.
Right.
So, you teach people over time a different system. That's how I see it.
That's interesting that you find grades as the bridge too far as opposed to any of the dozen of other things that would raise eyebrows and hackles.
That's a good point.
A couple of other things, structurally speaking. What about tracking and detracking? To what extent is that necessary to stop pulling out some kids for honors classes and the like, and others getting only basic and remedial stuff with others who are in that camp? Do you find detracking critical to create members of a heterogeneous society?
If you don't do that, everything else I've suggested is just making, I mentioned earlier, big schools in drag, right? I mean, if you don't change the way young people are organized in the building, and by the way, I don't only mean by ability, I also mean by age.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no other circumstance in American life where human beings are age segregated anywhere in the world.
Right.
Except school. Not really a thing, I don't think. But yes, I agree with you 100% on that. Now, that doesn't mean inside a class that in the egg shop, some kids are doing this incredibly complex and interesting rebuild of an engine, and other kids are still trying to figure out how gear systems work, right? Or in a math class, everybody's got the basic algebra, but one kid's doing these crazy formulas that even the teacher hasn't seen, and other kids are still working on the distributive process. That can happen inside a room with children of all sorts of perceived abilities.
But
right?
how do we see that? Do we see that as a problem for the teacher, where it would be more efficient to have homogeneity? Or do you see it as a gift, as something that can be folded in?
Darn it, you stole my word. I was going to say, I see it as a gift. Who wants to teach a bunch of people who all can do the exact same thing?
Right.
How uninteresting. But both for the teacher and the peers, the young
Yep.
people in the room. We and I know you're going to get to the school at some point, but
Yep.
one of the things my wife and I have thought, because the first thing we did here many years ago when I started was get rid of tracking. And one of the gifts we think we gave our two sons is that they went to school with people very different than them. And they grew up with the ability to talk to all sorts of people. And I think that's maybe the best gift we could have given them. But yeah, and it can be done. We did it. It can be done. I will tell you, the biggest opposition usually comes from parents of the most talented, or
Right.
perceived most talented, or perceived least talented. Kids in the middle, they're fine with that. It's not a big deal, right? But it's the two ends. The parents who think their children can't do math, how often do we hear that, feel that, oh, this is going to be too hard. My kid will never succeed. The parents of kids who do math in their sleep, it just seems to say, oh, they'll be dragged down. Well, not necessarily. Not in the hands of a good teacher who knows how to differentiate. And let me go back to, has the structured time in a class to make that happen.
Yep.
It's very difficult in 40 minutes.
Right.
You come in, you review the homework, you teach the next lesson, you get them started, and they're out the door. 80 minutes, you start with, okay, let's all go through these two problems. Tell me who had, you three had problems with that? You three didn't? Okay, you three work on this for a little bit. I'm going to take this three and do this, and the rest of you are going to do this. Well, you got 80 minutes.
That requires
So
time, and it
happen.
requires freedom from pressure to raise test scores, and all these things are connected, so it becomes really hard to make school change that's lasting and meaningful, because on the one hand, you can't do everything, but on the other hand, you have to do everything because A assumes that you have B, and B assumes you have C, and C assumes you have A, right? And yet, when people look at high schools and offer a critique from 30,000 feet, they just focus on, it's too easy. We need more rigor, right?
Oh, and don't forget what rigor means. Stern, unbending, unchanging, as in rigor mortis.
See synonyms, and harsh is what my dictionary says.
Harsh, there you go. That's another one, yes.
So when you're focused just on raising the bar and so on, and greater difficulty, you get people saying, we need AP courses, or we need an IB program, or something like that. We're letting kids off too easy. Yeah. Does great high school education of the kind we've been talking about have a place for things like AP courses for the select few?
I think it has a place for all sorts of things once you move beyond the solid core that everybody gets. I think every young person in a high school ought to get a really good grounding in writing and reading thoughtfully, in trying to understand the things that created our history, in understanding quantitative reasoning, and knowing about scientific processes. Oh man, that's a big one these days, right? So I think those have to be done for every student in an untracked manner, with every student getting access to what we would call high status knowledge, perhaps. I think it's just knowledge for life. At some point, then we start moving to particular interests. And you have a string quartet in addition to the band, or you have an advanced agricultural class where kids are actually running a land lab. Young people have different interests.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be met at the expense of everyone getting a foundation. And that's what happens often with AP courses. The AP courses have 13 kids in them, and the Algebra 1 has 32.
Well, we could have smaller classes that are electives for kids who want to do more in an area of interest without AP, which is not really about depth of learning, but about intensity of memorization, right?
Yes, and we have found that we tried some AP courses I didn't necessarily want to, but, I'm trying to be as democratic as I can be and let the staff make that decision. And what we found is kids coming back saying, well, it really didn't prepare me for calculus in college if that was the plan. They're not that good a course. So, again, I'm with you. Yeah. Have these electives that engage kids in things that, they might never have imagined they could do in high school. I mean, the other tool to do that, by the way, is a really strong internship program. If you're really interested in advanced mathematics, let's find a lab somewhere that'll take you on as an intern and go do advanced mathematics. Don't sit in a classroom and just keep writing it on a piece of paper, but go do it. And every town, even our little rural school district here in southeastern Ohio, we're close enough to Athens where there are all these physics labs and experimental labs and doctor's offices. Just send kids. That's the other thing you talked about, structure. I also think the high school walls need to be porous. People need to be coming in with stuff our teachers can't do, they don't know, and kids need to be going out doing things.
Yeah.
That's another structural piece, back to your structure.
Yeah, that's important. Right. So a minute ago, you used the phrase, I tried to be as democratic as I could be, and it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from a teacher, I think, one of your teachers or somebody named Joette Weber some years ago.
Yes, I can't believe you brought her up. That's great.
Yeah, who said, my goal is to be as democratic as I can stand, right? But that leads to something I'm wondering about here, which is how much can individual teachers do if they're not lucky enough to have an administrator like you? How much of this requires structural change made by administrators and school boards? What's your advice for high school teachers who are trapped in schools that look nothing like this? What can they do within their own classrooms?
So, three things.
Okay.
One, I got this advice from Elliot Wigington. You may remember him with the Foxfire Project. He wrote a book called Sometimes a Shining Moment. And his advice was to people in that situation was, rather than try and do a Foxfire Project, take a piece of the curriculum that you know really, really well, you're very comfortable with it, and turn it into an inquiry event. Just do it differently. Just one piece. Mm-hmm. And invite your administrator in to see it when it's humming, or your department chair or whoever, when it's really going well. When you got that kid that seems to show up in that principal's office 3 times a day but never is sent out of your class, have them come in and see why. Mm-hmm. Right? That's item 1. Item 2, find colleagues who think like you. You're not alone. You're just not talking to each other. I mean, that's what we found in many things around the country lately is we're not alone. No, a lot of people think like you do. A lot of people, find them. Get together with them for coffee. You mentioned Joette Weber. We used to call her one of the founding mothers of a group we called the Forum for Education and Democracy. And that was just a bunch of teachers from a bunch of schools in this county who said, we all think alike. Let's get together once a month and talk about this. And it gave great reassurance, great support. People could try stuff out in a friendly audience. Mm-hmm. And then I would say the third thing is go find, through your reading or visiting or conversations or listening to your podcast, go find examples of what you'd like to have happen and learn about them, and then take your administrator. Take a colleague. I was a school administrator. I still am. I loved it when a teacher came in and said, I have a problem and a solution. And so if you can bring people along, I think you can make a real difference. But I'm not going to deny the point you made. I think we have a real dearth of public school administrators who have a vision for anything besides just managing a building. And I am sad about that.
So your answers were focused more on how teachers can learn better how to do good things, keep up their morale, exchange ideas, the kinds of projects they can try to attempt. And then you focused on the limits of many administrators and the need to persuade administrators. But I guess I'm asking more of a structural question here, which is, if the goal is to help kids function in a democratic society, to feel connected, to explore ideas deeply, and so on, how much of that is possible with the best possible, most motivated teachers in a traditional high school setting?
Notice the long pause.
Noted.
It's not easy. I am not Pollyannish about the challenges. You mentioned that it was 40 years ago that Ted started pushing these things, and Debbie Meyer. There are some very persistent systems. I think the bottom line for me is you just have to start somewhere, and the suggestions I was giving were kind of places you could start.
Uh-huh.
I think, I'm struggling here.
Well, there is no easy answer to it. I've certainly been wrestling with it. I turn to you for guidance based on your experience, but I don't expect you to say you can achieve 61% of the goals if you're motivated and skilled enough in your classroom, regardless of 47-minute periods and standardized tests and what have you.
When I first came to Federal Hocking in 92, there were 3 teachers, Richard Thuray, Susan Murray, and Tim Arnold. And there was a science, a social studies, and an English teacher. And they had gotten together, very dissatisfied with what was going on in the school. I wasn't the administrator yet, right? This was before I got here.
Mm-hmm.
And they had gone to the principal and said, give us half of the incoming freshman class, and we will create a program for them of longer classes, more hands-on projects, all sorts of stuff. And the principal, not really being much of a leader, but being happy to be a follower, said, okay, you can do it. That started all the changes in that school. I mean, they built a different substructure within the school. And I guess that would be the model I would look at and say, you know what? That was the sit-in at the Greensboro lunch counter. That's what started opening the door. That's what started people saying, oh, wait a minute. And within the next year, when I came on, and we started proposing all sorts of changes, I remember a teacher walking in my office. She'd been here for like 30 years. She was pretty tough. And she came in and said, I've seen next year's schedule. Why aren't I on one of those teaching teams? Well, forget the fact that she had opposed it all the way along, but she saw how much fun those 3 teachers were having with fewer kids, more time, real projects, that she wanted to get in. And she was one of our biggest advocates for the next 5 years she taught here. So maybe that's what I missed on your question is inside your own school, building an alternative model that people can learn from. Now, sometimes they just circle up the wagons and shoot. Sometimes they just circle up the wagons around you and shoot at you. So be careful. But yeah.
But when I asked how much can a great teacher do in terms of the instruction in her own classroom, it sounds like your answer is, well, that teacher needs to try to work with other teachers to make structural change, implying limits to how much any great teacher can do without that structural change.
I think that's true. I think that the problem of the hero teacher is that he or she becomes the hero teacher, and everybody thinks you can only do that because you're great.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And so if you've got to find people that you bring along and say, no, we can all do this. This is the thing.
So when we talk about these ideas of prepared to be a democratic citizen, when we talk about deep thinking, when we talk about connection, social, moral, intellectual development, and all of that, with respect to all of the specific ways that we can go about that in a high school, how much of that is unique to a high school? What of what we've been talking about for 45 minutes applies uniquely to teenagers as opposed to elementary and middle school students?
Everything I learned in kindergarten. My wife was a kindergarten teacher. She was a wonderful kindergarten teacher.
Uh-huh.
And when I think of what we're talking about, I am reminded of a moment in her classroom. I was writing the first book I wrote, and I sat down and was taking notes and watching her work with kids, and I looked up on the wall, and there was this long list of classroom rules.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one was no smoking. And I thought, that is very strange. I will talk to her about that afterwards. I said, tell me about this list. And she said, well, this year the principal came in and said we were all going to do assertive discipline. Where you list your rules on the wall, you know the whole routine, put a check mark by the name. And she said, I didn't think that was really going to be very democratic or a way to engage kids. So the principal never told me how I had to make the rules. So the first day of class, I sat all the kids down and I said, what do you think the classroom rules should be? And the first little hand went up and said, no smoking. So she put it up. And the second one was no throwing books at the lights. Well, okay, she put that one up. And she said, I've never had to put a check mark by those rules all year long. But the point of my little story being, I think it's developmental, but I think the things apply to kids all the way through. I mean, At the high school, we let kids have an equal say in who we hire as staff. Yep. They have their own interview committee. They interview. We've had people turn down interviews because they don't want to be interviewed by kids. Well, that's a really good sign. We don't want them. But they have an equal vote, and they meet separate from the staff committee, so they're not overwhelmed by that. By the staff committee, and we have hired wonderful teachers because of that. And I think that's a pretty powerful moment for a kid to leave high school saying, I helped hire that staff.
Are you giving that as an example of something you wouldn't do in an elementary or middle school, is have the kids?
I probably wouldn't turn elementary school kids loose choosing the teacher because they could be bribed.
Allowed to smoke, for example.
Yeah.
So there are, but many of the other things we've been talking about maybe even go double for younger kids with less departmentalization, something closer to an advisory all the time, no homework, etc., right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say they're all human beings at a particular point of development. And let's remember, in world history, very young children were responsible for a whole lot more than they are now.
Yeah.
I mean, some people do argue they're a little coddled now. I mean, but I don't know that I want to go back to those days. But I think kids are capable of a lot more than we believe.
Okay. So let's talk a little more now. And I understand why this has already leaked into some extent about your experience at Federal Hawking. You left academia to try to put into practice, you said, what you've been describing. And you became a principal in this rural high school in Stewart, Ohio in 1992, immediately began restructuring it with fewer and longer class periods and interdisciplinary teaching. And you stayed on as principal and or superintendent for 28 years. And you retired or tried to retire and fish. And you got pulled back in. So before... what then and now, did these changes you made at the beginning stick? And did they stick after you left?
So they stuck while I was here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a lesson I have learned.
Yeah.
It's how much unsticking can be done by ill-intentioned administrators. There was a concern by one of the superintendents they brought in behind me that high school teachers had too much planning time. Because if you have a 4-period day, they get 1 period planning. And his solution to that was just to wreck the schedule. The staff, here's the interesting thing. The staff fought back and actually filed a grievance, which led to a binding arbitration, because they had not been appropriately considered in the scheduling changes through our site-based process. And they actually won. And that has led, since I've come back, to us working. Next year we'll go back. That's funny. We'll go back to the future, if you will, to what we had been doing successfully for 28 some years. We're also rebuilding our advisory program, which had been languishing, and rebuilding the senior project requirement, which had also been tossed out by the former superintendents. So, yeah, it's not a fairy tale. It's not a pretty story. But the bottom line is the bones are still there, right? There was a lot of the same sort of teaching still going on. There were a lot of teachers double blocking courses. There was the bones of an advisory system that some teachers were still working real well with. Mm-hmm. So that held on in spite of the structural attacks, or the attacks on the structure that the former superintendents led. And let's just say one quit and the other one got fired, and here I am. So
okay.
Maybe the community thought they'd lost something.
Right. But we've seen this all over the country. Debbie Meyer can talk a lot about what happens when you have a truly extraordinary leader and the undertow does its work when that leader leaves, right? But let's talk about the time throughout your initial period there. Did you get pushback from parents, from the school board, from the legislature?
So I got fired once over the portfolio and projects. The community wasn't happy with that decision, rallied and elected a new school board, and I got my job back.
Wow.
There's always been pushback, but here's the thing. I welcome it. That's what our society's about. You run out ideas, you debate them, you struggle over them, you push back and forth, and you get better at them. I mean, let me tell you, the first portfolio project design we sent out to the community was not real good. They were right. Mm-hmm. It ignored the things that people valued their kids would take away from high school. So we rewrote it. When I came back, I said, look, I made a mistake. Let's rewrite this. Let's make it better. We brought some of the dissenting parents in. Let's work on this. And we did. And it got better. So, I mean, we can't just like democracy when we get our way.
Right.
Right. We have to be willing that there's going to be pushback. People see things differently than I do. It doesn't make them bad human beings. It doesn't make them inherently wrong. John Dewey himself once said, to be a genuine pragmatist, I have to believe everything I know could be wrong.
Mm-hmm. But do you think overall that you've been fairly successful in persuading people in this town to consider very untraditional and theoretically unsettling ideas about creating a high school for their kids that looks very little like the high school they attended?
Yes. And now let me say, it's not so hard to go back to it, because guess what? Many of our kids here, their parents went to that high school.
Well, that's what happens when you've been around as long as you have doing this. Yeah, more than a quarter of a century doing it.
The treasurer just told me that I'm the oldest person working in the district, so I don't know what that means.
I know exactly what it means, and so do you. So what about teachers? This has always struck me as a fascinating challenge, both theoretically and practically, which is when you've got traditional teachers, there's only so much you can do, and you can only do it so fast through hiring. And you want to value teacher autonomy, not controlling them, but sometimes giving them the right to do what they want in the classroom pulls in the opposite direction from the direction you're hoping to create in all the classrooms. How do you strike that balance?
I always start with the question of, explain to me why you're doing that.
Okay.
Let me first begin to try and understand how you see this. It's often about content. It's often about, I worry that kids will leave without something. It's not usually about, I hate children, so I'm going to make school as bad as I can make it. It's more about, I just feel I can't leave this piece out. I had a social studies teacher. He retired last year. I loved him. He was the first teacher I hired. And he could not get away from the weapons of World War II. He just loved that topic. It was fundamental to his being, right? And I used to push him. I said, Brad, why? And finally I said, Brad, explain to me why this is so important. And he had a really classic explanation of, these were the things that weren't only built by American industry and American working people. These were the things that farm boys kept together out in the fields of Belgium and Germany. And I think our kids need to understand the ingenuity it took of a soldier, tired, cold, worn out, but could still figure out how to make things work so he or she could stay alive. And I thought, that's a really fascinating thing. I had no idea. And when I watched him teach it, yeah, that's what he was doing. And I thought, well, valuable lesson for kids. I'm not going to take that away. So sometimes I'm wrong.
And for teachers who are just not able to give some decision-making authority to the kids, or teachers who are uncomfortable doing anything but lecturing and giving quizzes and homework, what do you do?
You put them in an 80-period day and you say, good luck lecturing every day. Have a good time. They can't do it, Calfee. End of the first week, when we first went to 4-period days, I told the staff, I really appreciate how well you're doing. I'd like to take you all out for a happy hour. And we all met at a bar. Yeah. It's the cheapest happy hour I ever had to do, because after one beer, they all said, I've used up so much stuff. I got to go home and start planning. You have to accept people where they are. They're not going to all be the Joette Webbers. You mentioned Joette early. She's one of the greatest teachers I've ever seen. They're not all going to be the Richard Thorés they're going to be all over the place because they're human beings. So you just create settings and environments where you let them try different stuff, right? Put them next to a teacher doing something. And there are always going to be teachers just say, I'm not doing any differently. This is what I'm doing. And you're just going to have to live with that, because we live with bank tellers who do it badly. We live with executives of major corporations who are absolute wrecks. If a kid has one bad experience out of 7 in a year, I guess I have to live with that, to be honest.
All right. And to what extent does this model, can we call it progressive? Are you comfortable with that adjective?
Absolutely.
So a progressive high school is rare. Mm-hmm. Did you have any trouble with college admission?
None. They come to us.
Wow.
When we show them what these kids, let me tell you, we are one of, if not the poorest school communities in the state of Ohio. Mm-hmm. Average family income a little bit under $30,000. Poverty rate of about 65%. When we send them young people who can do every bit as well as the kids from Upper Arlington, they beat our doors down. They want our kids. They come from Appalachia. They're a disadvantaged population. We have had kids win the highest scholarships at Ohio University, Ohio State University, full rides to Harvard. I think we sent one to Smith last year. I'm not saying that's the only thing you do, but you ask about colleges in particular, and I'm going to say we knocked that one out of the park.
Right. Well, that's consistent with historical evidence. The famous 8-year study, the more progressive the high school, the better they did in university. Yeah. So yours was not the only exciting high school, though it remains kind of an exception. Let's talk just briefly about the coalition. The Coalition of Essential Schools, started by Ted Sizer and Deborah Meyer, started in 1984. It died in about 2017, down from 1,000 schools to fewer than 100. At the end, I think you were the chair of the board, as a matter of fact. Amazing schools. Do you have a sense of the number of schools that, even though there isn't a coalition to bring them together, are still pursuing its mission and doing the kinds of things that you are?
I don't have a sense of the numbers. I do know they're out there. I just got contacted by a young man in California who wants to try and get schools back together. There are some of the coalition's problem was it never sold anything. It gave away everything. So there was no income stream. So when Ted couldn't, knock on the Annenberg's door and get a bunch of money, we just kind of ran out of gas. That was the bottom line. But the centers still function across the country. A strong one in California, one in New York. I believe there's still one in Chicago. I should also say there's still the Progressive Education Network. Now, that's primarily private schools.
Yes.
You'll find a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And I'm also interested, I am not a fan of commercial charter schools, but there are a number of independent charter schools that are doing some really fascinating stuff that are still out there. So, and as I said, there's remnants. People talk about their advisory program, and I just laugh and say, yep, I knew when that started. And they're just doing it as the norm and doing it well. So internships are a common thing in like every school now. But let a kid leave school during the day? No, 30 years ago, right? But Debbie Meyer was sending them all over New York City, and we all learned from that. So I think there are pieces out there. It's not the movement it was. And partially, it's also because public education is fighting for its life in the face of legislatures that do not like public schools.
Right.
They're running voucher programs, they're running private school programs, they're cutting our funding. They just don't like us. And so another reason I think to fight back and be different.
Okay, fair enough. And there are a couple of other networks out there. I think the big picture company that Dennis Litke started still exists,
Litke,
right? Even though he's not doing that anymore. It's still progressive, right?
Yep, very much. Great schools.
The New York Performance Standards Consortium.
Still moving along.
Some individual schools are doing it, but not with the kind of energy that they had with the coalition at its prime, leaving it to individuals to keep this going. When you appeared not only at coalition conferences, but at other education events around the country, George, one of the things that most impressed me about you immediately is that almost every time I can remember when you showed up with some kids.
Yep.
You brought students with you to do the presentation to the adults. Do you have any favorite experiences with the things that some of those kids you brought along shared with the adults?
It's great. I had two. One was at a coalition meeting where my book, Schools at Work, was just about to come out. Mm-hmm. And Ted Sizer ran a seminar on it with a bunch of kids from our school and other schools. And it was a great moment. And the other one was I did a keynote at a coalition talk, and I invited 3 graduates to come with me. And I let each one of them speak about what high school had meant to them, and then asked the audience to draw out what happened with these kids that you wish would happen in your school, and how could you make it happen? And the learning in that room was really powerful. Uh-huh. By the way, they weren't all college kids. I mean, one of them was in the operating engineers, one of them was a chef, and one of them had gone on to some East Coast private college. So they were all different.
The fact that you brought the students along at all seems consistent with the fact that your high school students participate in hiring new teachers. It's a way of, walking the walk or the talk or whatever that cliche has it, of saying we treat you seriously with trust and respect. And as listeners of this podcast have heard me say more than once, the way kids learn to make good decisions is by making decisions, right? Not by following directions. To wrap this up, first, ed schools, teacher training, what should they be doing, and to what extent are they doing it in order to help realize this vision and produce teachers who would fit in quite naturally and enthusiastically in a school like yours?
I think they need to engage. We have an interesting project here where we work with pre-service teachers with Ohio University for 3 years. They identify our school as something they're interested in. They work with us, and they finally do their student teaching. I guess they call it student internship now here. And then some even stay on to do a teaching fellowship year. I think this is along the model in Sweden where they have such good success, where kids are identified in their education program and they work side by side with a teacher operating in these ways, and they actually do an internship year as their first year of teaching. I think moving towards that supply of teachers would be really powerful. The other piece is they've got to get better, and I don't know how to help them do this, but they've got to get better at their administrator development. They teach school law, they teach finance, they teach nothing about vision, they teach nothing about learning, they teach nothing about human relations with staff. The programs need to be fundamentally retooled so they're not just about how do you run a building. It's like why I disagree with business administration major, right? Oh, you got a BA, you got a master's in business administration, now you can go run any kind of company. No, not really. Everyone's different. Same with the way we treat education administrators, and so much of it's online. It's so much BS. Let's be honest.
Interesting. You hear less critique of how the universities are turning out admins, and it's mostly about teachers.
If I was the world czar on education in America, I'd be putting a lot of energy into preparing the next generation of administrators.
Yeah. Ted once said something like, I think he was talking about teacher preparation programs, but I'm sure it applies to administrator programs as well. He said something like, these programs are just preparing people to teach in the schools that currently exist, not to create better schools and districts and so on.
Once again, Ted, completely on the money.
Yep, absolutely. Last question. Feel free to pass on this, but I have a memory that quarter of a century ago, your youngest kid in middle school said, I'm going to boycott the standardized tests. How's he doing now?
A shout out to John Wood. Way to go. John refused to take the high school graduation test. He did not graduate from high school. He went on to a very successful undergraduate career at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
One of the great unknown secrets in America, by the way, is you don't have to have a high school diploma to get into college. A lot of them will take you without one. He worked for Outward Bound, and he's moved back here. He farmed for a while, and now he is the director of Parks and Recreation for the Athens City Parks Department.
Lovely.
Yeah, he's doing fine. Thanks for asking. I'll tell him you asked.
Some of us remember what some would consider a skeleton in the closet. You would consider I don't know, what's the opposite of a skeleton?
It's a badge of honor. The op-ed in the Columbus Dispatch saying what a bad father I was and how misguided John was is still on my wall.
Ironically, of course. But we would expect reflective rebels, and we would expect a deeper degree of life satisfaction as a result, probably not unlike the deeper level of life satisfaction and thinking we would expect from the kids who come from your school and the people who've read your books. So, George, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing all you're doing. And I don't know how much longer you're going to be back out of retirement there, but I hope what you're able to do is anchored so that the traditionalists, when they come in your wake, are unable, not just unwilling, to yank it up and return to the status quo.
Let's just say I have a better plan for succession this time.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks, George.
Thank you. Thanks so much.